Okay, guys, so sorry I can't be with you, but I'm going to try and compensate for that as best as I possibly can by talking you through the first half of Mark on the Wall, um, which I will then screencast for you to fit complete for our homework task over the week long break. The story itself almost I want to think about in conceptual terms as a step back almost from Kew Gardens in terms of its interiority. It is, I would say, even more interior than what we see in Kew Gardens because we don't really get any exteriority from this narrative perspective. It is first person, but it is first person stream of consciousness. So unlike Kew Gardens where we get a third person omniscient narrator that penetrates the mind of characters at will, in Mark on the Wall we have a first person narrator who takes us through her own stream of consciousness. It's worth bearing in mind a few important contextual details to this story before we get stuck into it. And one of them is that there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that this is heavily autobiographical, this narrative, and that the female speaking voice is the speaking voice of a female writer. It's worth knowing also that Woolf suffered from what we think bipolar disorder and bouts of really chronic depression and poor mental health, and I think that is extremely evident in this story itself. It also seems very similar to The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, which is a sort of a seminal text in feminist literary studies. And I think this story in many ways speaks to many of the same themes, and it's about enclosed, entrapped female speakers who find themselves at odds with their external surroundings. In this case, I want to think about the concept of interiority as a space of intellectual liberation for the female narrator in this particular story, and the external world as being something that is exclusively patriarchal and controlled by men. And so what I hope you're starting to see now is the reason why we spent such a long time thinking about the way to apply those theoretical positions, because we're going to start using them more and more as we go through these stories. So let's get stuck into the first paragraph. Before you do this, make sure you've actually read the text at least once through, just so that you've got a simple sense of its plot, if we can call it that. And it's really it's a plot of shifting mental subjects that take their initial impetus from the external world, but generally the dynamism and the vitality of this story is entirely internal. So it starts in a very tentative, what we call temporal orientation. Perhaps it was the middle of January in the present that I first looked up and saw the mark on the wall. So we've got this tentative orientation in time. We think about the concept of relativism and how perception itself was relativistic during this era, and Einstein's discoveries particularly showed us that even a supposedly objective concept like time had been exposed to be relative in scientific terms. And I think that profoundly influenced impressionistic art and modernist prose particularly. And so we've got this, again, uncertain orientation in times that's developed in the second sentence. In order to fix the date, it's necessary to remember what one saw. And so the time here is relative to the speaker's attempt to fix a sensory memory. And so we've got an effort to try and be precise about time that is taking its impetus, it's being driven by sensory memories, not the other way around, In this sense, time itself is what is bendy and malleable and uncontrollable, and that the sensory memories are what seem to be more reliable. And she anchors herself with a sensory memory. So now I think of the fire, the steady film of yellow light upon the page of my book, the 3 chrysanthemums in the round glass bowl on the mantelpiece. Yes, it must have been winter time. And so there's an unstable effort, I think, to fix the moment in time itself. And that mind is making sense of time in response to sensory details like the steady film of yellow light, the chrysanthemums in the round glass bowl. And so time itself is what is unstable here. And the nature of perception itself is the subject again. But it's the nature of perception first, and then time as a corollary, as a consequence of that. It must have been wintertime. We'd just finished our tea, for I remember that I was smoking a cigarette when I looked up and saw the mark on the wall for the first time. I looked up through the smoke of my cigarette, and I think there seems to be here something symbolic about this smoke. The haze of memory itself, I think, is being rendered in these terms, that the memory is anchored in this sensory perception, which is itself a hazy one, looking up through the smoke of my cigarette. And my eye lodged for a moment on the burning coals, and that old fancy of the crimson flag flapping from the castle tower came into my mind. And so what we've got here is the associative nature of memory that's being rendered in this description, that's being depicted. The burning coals are bringing to mind an old dream about a red flag flapping from a castle, which I think is uncomfortable to the speaker because it functions as a reminder of war. And I think this memory is the impetus for the shift inwards, that war is the external world, war is the outside context, war is where patriarchy has brought us. And therefore the inside world, the life of interiority, is the only place that the speaker feels like she has any recourse to liberty, to freedom, to independence. And I thought of the cavalcade of red knights riding up the side of the black rock, and again you can see it's a militaristic image that the red burning coals in the fire have brought to her mind. Rather, to my relief, the sight of the mark interrupted the fancy, for it was an old fancy, an automatic fancy, made as a child perhaps. The mark was a small round mark, black upon the white wall, about 7 inches above the mantelpiece. I've not actually written this on my annotations here, but the mark on the wall is a symbol itself of the shift inwards, the shift to the interior life as the source of vitality and of meaning, and the shift away from the external world, which is, I think, symbolized quite nicely in this cavalcade of red knights, which becomes, I think, a symbol in her mind of conflict and war and everything about external reality. It's worth stressing at this moment that this story was written in 1917, that, Woolf had a very real experience of worrying about her husband being conscripted, which for someone suffering from extreme mental health problems would have been a serious point, would have engendered, I think, a serious crisis in her health very early in her life. We move on. She says, how readily our thoughts swarm upon a new object, lifting it a little way as ants carry a blade of straw so feverishly and then leave it. The description here is actually zoomorphism, which is like personification, but it's giving something inanimate the quality of an animal rather than a person. So our thoughts swarm. The thoughts themselves are brought to life through this description. Upon a new object, and this being the mark on the wall, lifting it a little away as ants carry a blade of straw so feverishly and then leave it. And so this simile, comparing the movement of thoughts to ants carrying a blade of grass, gives us this sense of the mind's intense, dynamic vitality, its life and its energy, that it can be powerfully, energetically focused on this seemingly uninteresting little physical circumstance. But that dynamic vitality is what is interesting. The mind itself and the nature of perception is what is interesting rather than the thing that it's looking at. This story isn't really about mainly the mark on the wall. It is the mark on the wall and what it does to the mind of the person perceiving it. But equally, whilst it's important and powerful, it can suddenly and whimsically leave it and then leave it. And this ellipsis here, I think, shows us that tension between intense activity and dynamic energy that the mind has and its uncontrollable, sort of whimsical decision making. It can just leave it, it can make nothing happen. If that mark was made by a nail, it can't have been for a picture, it must have been for a miniature. The miniature of a lady with white powdered curls, powder dusted cheeks, and lips like red carnations. A fraud, of course, for the people who had this house before us would have chosen pictures in that way, an old picture for an old room. So she's imagining here that the mark was made by a nail, and what that nail would have been for was to hang up a miniature picture. And now, I think what you can see here is obviously her speculation about what that picture would be and the class pretensions of the people that would have maybe hung up a picture like that. So there's a speculation on the class pretensions of the prior residents. And that this miniature of a lady with white powdered curls and dusted cheeks and lips like red carnations is someone deliberately displaying their socioeconomic superiority. And this is why she calls it a fraud. For the people who had this house before us would have chosen pictures in that way. And it's fraudulent because it's not exactly who those people were, and she must know that because she's bought the house from them. So there's a sense of pretense, I think, from their prior residence. And she calls it an old picture for an old room. And I think that sense of socioeconomic hierarchy and class values is what she's detected in this picture that doesn't even exist. And that those values are dying values. And that the new values in the speaker's mind are of the mind, of internal life, of mental space, away from an external world that is controlled by men and masculinity. That is the sort of people. They were very interesting people, and I think of them so often in such queer places because one will never see them again, never know what happened next. And so what you've got here is this sense of sudden importance and then sudden distance and alienation, which I think mirrors the dynamic of thought in the opening sentence. And so that changeable, random nature of the plot of life itself is what we see here. People can be brought in close proximity and close relationship to each other, but then can be completely and irrevocably separated from each other all of a sudden and at great, almost on a whim. And so I think the incidents of life seem to mirror the dynamic of thought that Woolf is so fascinated by in this story. They wanted to leave this house because they wanted to change their style of furniture, so he said, and was in the process of saying that in his opinion art should have ideas behind it when we were torn asunder. I think there's something ironic about these two descriptions here of the people that lived in this house previously, that they wanted to move house because they needed to change the style of furniture. There's something sort of euphemistic and fantastically British about this, that this is an evasive, euphemistic way of not really saying the truth, and that art should have ideas behind it. That is a statement of sort of artistic integrity, whilst this one is a statement of sort of fashionable superficiality. And I think there's an ironic sort of juxtaposition in that phrase that reveals the sort of the whimsical superficiality of the people that lived in this house before. Then this phrase, when we were torn asunder, she's talking about herself and the people who lived in the house before and their relations. But I think the phrase itself is almost hyperbolic, that she doesn't really care too much about these people, but that life ripped them apart. And that we see, I think, there's an enormous sense of ironic sarcasm in the tone here of Woolf towards these people who bought the house before the speaker. However, she says, as one is torn from the old lady about to pour out tea and the young man about to hit the tennis ball in the back garden of the suburban villa, as one rushes past in the train. And this, I think, captures the nature of narrative, of the narrative point of view, not so much in this story, but more in Kew Gardens. I think we get those glimpses inside the mind and inside the lives of people, and then the narrative rushes us past on the train of life. And so we see these narrative point of view, a kind of metaphor for Woolf's narrative form, and the difficulty of actually fully capturing the internal life of people and characters. But that's precisely what I think this story seems to try and remedy, is to, instead of rushing past on the train, is to dwell at the station, if you carry on this metaphor, of this speaker's mind. We spend our time in this story inside the mind of the speaker. And she keeps coming back to the mark. But as for that mark, I'm not sure about it. I don't believe it was made by a nail after all. It's too big, too round for that. And so what you see here is the instability of perception itself, which provides the space for speculation. And so it's the fact that she's not really sure, what she's looking at, that actually provides the energy and the dynamism and the impetus for the stream of consciousness that we're given, the speculations, the thoughts that those speculations lead to, the associative memory that those speculations and thoughts provoke, and that mental energy and dynamic and the chain of mental thought. All of that is possible because of the nature of this physical perception and its instability. I might get up, but if I got up and looked at it 10 to 1, I shouldn't be able to say for certain, because once a thing's done, no one knows how it happened. Oh dear me, the mystery of life, the inaccuracy of thought. So these statements themselves, I think, develop this thought about physical perception and certainty being an illusion. The nature of perception itself is uncertain, and that it's an explicit articulation of that form. And so there's what we would say, I think, the style of this sentence, the syntax, which is fragmented, shows us, I think, perhaps the loss of rigid mental control over life, and actually the illusion of mental control over life. One of the vocabulary words that would be particularly useful to describe this prose style is phenomenological, like a phenomenon. It's the phenomenology is the study of the nature of perception. And so this prose attempts, I think, to explicitly direct the phenomenological apprehension and comprehension of the surroundings. That is what this story is about, is the way that we perceive and the way that our perception interacts with our thoughts. And that thought is inaccurate and that humanity is ignorant because we delude ourselves into thinking that it's more precise than it really is. To show how very little control of our possessions we have, what an accidental affair this living is after all of our civilization. Let me just count over a few things lost in one lifetime. So the transfer of the train of thought here is from the inaccuracy and the lack of control that we have over perception to the actual lack of physical control that we have over the things that we supposedly own. And that hyphenated expression shows us that the accidental randomness of life takes precedence over the supposed control and order of the external world and of civilization. And so this loss of possessions, I think, is symbolic of our loss of or our inability to control the world or external reality. And this is what the speaker ends up detailing for us in this stream of consciousness that we see later on. Beginning, for that seems always the most mysterious of losses. What cat would gnaw, what rat would nibble? 3 pale blue canisters of bookbinding tools. Then there were the bird cages, the iron hoops, the steel skates, the Queen Anne coal scuttle, the bagatelle board, the hand organ. All gone, and jewels too. And so in this first sort of itinerary of things that are lost, the seemingly random nature of the objects seems, I think, to capture a chaotic sense of external reality. They're nothing that anyone could ascribe deliberate motivation for. You can't picture anyone destroying or stealing any of these things. And so their loss to the speaker seems like random chaos, and that random chaos is the nature of external reality itself. And then there's a small transition. All gone, and jewels too, opals and emeralds. They lie about the roots of turnips. And so that juxtaposition there of jewels and precious stones with the most mundane, sort of unglamorous vegetable, I think deliberately provides a rationale for this narrative. That within the roots of turnips, within the detritus and the dust and the and the sort of fallout of everyday thought, there are these precious stones of epiphany, of realization, of self-understanding. And that's what this narrative seeks to do. It seeks to scrape and pare away at the mind and to find those little gems in there. This is what she says: what a scraping, paring affair it is, to be sure. The wonder is that I've any clothes on my back, that I sit surrounded by solid furniture at this moment. And so there's a sense of surprise here that external reality is fluid and unreliable, and, and that the physical rigidity and reliability of the clothes and the chair seem in some way to be at odds with that fluid, dynamic sense of chaos. Why? If one wants to compare life to anything, one must liken it to being blown through the tube at 50 miles an hour, landing at the other end without a single hairpin in one's hair. Now, this metaphor here shows us this sense of a loss of power and control over reality, that life itself, in this sort of existential drama, is equivalent to being blown through the underground in London at 50 miles an hour and landing at the other end with no control over your appearance. She says, shot out at the feet of God entirely naked, tumbling head over heels in the asphodel meadows like brown paper parcels pitched down a chute in the post office. And so we've got this second metaphor, being thrown through meadows like paper parcels thrown down the kind of postage chute in a post office. We move through life with this unrelenting energy and almost no control over the circumstances of our existence, with one's hair flying back like the tail of a racehorse. Yes, that seems to express the rapidity of life, the perpetual waste and repair, also casual, also haphazard. I think there's this there's a conscious, deliberate attempt to reflect on the state of meaninglessness that the speaker finds themselves in. But what we see is that we have this dynamic constantly, from the mark on the wall down the end, at the beginning of a paragraph, to the sort of profound philosophical epiphanies, and that this dynamic from external circumstance that's unstable to profound mental insight is precisely what Woolf is trying to capture in this narrative, the life of the mind in response to an unstable external environment. But then we have this segue, but after life, with this sort of suggestion of perhaps what goes on, after we die, the slow pulling down of thick green stalks so that the cup of the flower as it turns over deluges one with purple and red light. And so I think this perhaps is a metaphor for perception itself, the pulling down of thick green stalks so that the cup of flower deluges with one with purple and red light. There's a sort of greediness to this image that we wait for death almost to gain some sense of insight, and that this is a metaphor for the process of perception, almost destructive and greedy. It says, why after all should one not be born there as one is born here, helpless, speechless, unable to focus one's eyesight, groping at the roots of the grass at the toes of the giants? And so there's this questioning then of, even in the afterlife, even in heaven, why would you be any different? Why would you be able to perceive when in your life you're helpless, speechless, and unable to focus your eyesight, and you grope at the roots of grass and at the toes of giants? So there's this suggestion of alienation, both in actual life and in the afterlife, and that knowledge and perception itself is impossible or beyond possibility in both realms, is an incredibly bleak statement about the nature of the way that we perceive. As for saying which are trees and which are men and women, or whether there are such things that won't be in a condition to do for 50 years or so, there will be nothing but spaces of light and dark intersected by thick stalks, and rather higher up perhaps rose-shaped blots of an indistinct colour, dim pinks and blues, which will as time goes on become more definite, become I don't know what. And so what we've got here is a much more humble and honest representation of unfolding knowledge and perception that shows a much more resistant attitude towards categorization. As for saying which are trees and which are men and women, or whether there are such things that won't be in a condition to do for 50 years or so, sentence actually isn't a complete one, so this is a sort of fragmentary sentence structure. It shows us that the thought itself is incomplete, and there will be nothing but spaces of light and dark. And what you can see, I think, is a reversion to much more generic diction of light and dark, thick stalks, higher up. They're very binaristic adjectives that don't really give a great deal of precision, and that's precisely the point. They're rose-shaped blots of an indistinct colour, pinks and blues, and that's the closest that we get to precision, but even that is hyphenated inside the sentence to give it a sense of momentary precision, which will, as time goes on, become more definite, become I don't know what. And so the sentence ends without resolving itself. And so for all of its repetitions of become, and its fragments, we get this sense of perception as something unstable and unformed, and that's really what this honestly captures. It captures honestly this story, the uncertain nature of perception, but in that uncertainty reveals the energetic vitality of the mind.